Hello everybody, welcome to another development blog here from the Brantford Games Lab, where we are developing a game to combat climate change for the Ontario Ministry for the Environment. I am Stephen Riley, part of the team of students here from across Ontario who is developing this game. This week I am joined by
Yelena.
Yelena, what do you do here on the team?
I am a designer.
Excellent. I am also joined by
Connor.
And Connor, what do you do here on the team?
I'm a programmer.
Excellent. We are developing a game that is a collection of mini-games similar to WarioWare and Dumb Ways to Die. And each one of these mini-games is a little action the player can take in their daily life to reduce their emissions. And by playing all these little mini-games, teaching the player how to do that and showing the benefit of that, we will hopefully convince the player or show the player why they should reduce their emissions.
Yeah.
So we're developing two different games here for the purposes of our research with the same set of mini games. So the first game has a narrative around it, focusing on really giving the player that sort of bleak look and perspective that in the year 2100, on our current projection of emissions, the global average temperature will have increased 6 degrees Celsius, and that's the point of no return, ultimate climate catastrophe, Yelena.
Yeah.
Game over for planet Earth, and we're handing that message to them in the form of this narrative of them being contacted from that year 2100 by a researcher who's telling them they got to start making the changes now to save the planet. And our other game is a more casual version of that, similar to Dumb Ways to Die, where it is just the mini games. Each mini game being a behavioral change the player can make to reduce their emissions, but there's no story or there's a very, very light context to it as opposed to the narrative version of the game. So we're developing these simultaneously so that when we start doing the research, we can get some people to play the casual version and some people to play the narrative version and see which one's more effective. Whether having that story turns people off and they don't like the heavy message, or having that perspective is really helpful and maybe people don't know that, and having the casual version is not as effective. I want to start with some playtesting. We did a lot of playtesting, isn't that right, Yelena?
Yeah, we did.
This week we playtested 3 games. What were the 3 games, Yelena?
It was the tire pressure game, the carpooling game, and our escape room game.
Explain the escape room game and the carpool game for people.
Okay, so the escape room game is where players are interacting with a room and trying to unplug and turn off as many devices as they can before they leave to catch a bus. That's the idea behind it anyways. And then the carpooling game is the player is making routes for a group of people who have different destinations. And the idea is to show players that, hey, carpooling actually takes up a lot less gas, and if each individual person was to go in their own car and go to their own destinations,
they would burn more gas.
Yeah, they would.
Generating more emissions. And the turning off all the electronics before you leave, leaving things plugged in and on uses energy. That's not good.
That's not good.
The third game we played tested this week is one Connor's been working on, which is sort of our vertical slice, which is basically how we're going to model all of the other mini games in terms of tutorial, in terms of presenting the game, and in terms of length and scoring the game. So Connor, you were working on this tire pressure game. What is the basic idea of the game?
The basic idea is that as your tire pressure goes down in your car, the car won't run as efficiently, and the point is that the less efficient the car runs, the more fuel you consume, and thus the more emissions you create.
And so we are showing the player this by having them play through a game where they do what?
In the game, you are tasked with getting to a destination within a certain amount of time, and during your driving, your tire pressure will go down, and that affects how fast your fuel goes down as well. And you want to take your standard stops to make sure you pump up your tires.
It's sort of like an accelerated day-night cycle, because of course your tire pressure doesn't go down in like a couple hours. It's something you have to check over the course of like a month and stuff, right? Okay, so these were what we play tested, and we got some invaluable feedback. Yelena, how valuable is the feedback we get from playtesting?
It is super, 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 super important.
5 super important. This feedback. What did we learn from playtesting these little mini games with the folks we brought in?
Well, first of all, one of the mini games, I believe it was the tire pressure game, had like a kind of a wall of text, and that turned off as a tutorial, and that turned off players real quick because they would see the first page and then just skip through the rest and get into the game and not understand how the game works.
Right.
So that was an issue. Another issue was a bit of the UI. There were a few players that that pointed out that maybe a certain placement of, like, for an example, the tire pressure bar, they wanted it to be presented all the time. And that's something that the design team is debating right now, because we want to convey in the game that, like, you have to check it. Like, it's not always going to be obvious that
There's
your tire
nothing on the
pressure's-
dashboard of your car saying tire pressure.
Yeah.
That's something you have to check.
That's something that you have to physically check, and we wanted to convey that in the game. So we've been working around with that idea. The escape room game was pretty successful playtest-wise. And the carpooling game, we discovered a bug, which is important.
Very important.
And other than that, yeah, most of our issues were in the tutorials, really.
So we're reworking the tutorials.
Yeah.
And this is something that we learn in these early playtests that we then apply to all the mini games, right?
Yeah.
And part of our playtest process is because we're doing research on the effectiveness of these games in terms of reducing people's emissions and affecting like behavioral changes, we're using survey questions. We ask the player before they play and after they play. So for example, the tire pressure game, before they play, we would ask them, how often do you check your tire pressure? Do you know the correlation between low tire pressure and worse performance, increased emissions? And so
Yeah.
these types of questions will, if they answered no beforehand and they played the game and they answered yes and they answered they will be checking their tire pressure, and that's something they're starting to do, we know the game hasn't affected a behavioral change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Yelena, part of what you did this week was brainstorming ideas for a couple new mini games as well as playtesting. And one of these games was a brainchild of yours. Why don't you talk about it?
So for the longest time, I've been working on this leftovers mini game. So today I basically made a paper prototype of that because there were a few parameters that the designers were debating about. So we decided to playtest that instead.
So why don't you tell us about the leftovers game and how it contributes to emissions?
So in this particular mini game, players are looking in their fridge, which has leftovers in them, and they're trying to create a recipe with these leftovers, and they're trying to buy the least amount of like extra foods that they may need for said recipe. The idea behind that is that a lot of people tend to either like leave leftovers in their fridge until they rot and throw them out, or some people even argue that like they don't like eating the same things like on several consecutive days, so they'll just throw out their leftovers. And the idea behind this game is to show people like, hey, you can use your leftovers in other meals even if you don't want to eat those exact same leftovers. And that contributes to, decomposition causes some greenhouse gases such as methane and CO2.
Buying new groceries.
Buying new groceries adds to like the emissions in transportation, in packaging, in even some other food wastage, because some foods get thrown out in the process of being shipped. So
this game's currently in the paper prototype stage.
yeah, paper prototype stage.
We'll be starting digital prototyping next week.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully, and we'll also be doing a lot more prototyping in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for watching. We are posting these development updates every week so that you can follow along with us. Be sure to follow at BGN Lab on Twitter and at ON Environment on Twitter for the Ministry of Environment. They're the ones funding this project and working with us to make sure we create the most effective games. Thank you so much for joining me, Yelena.
Yeah, not a problem, Steven. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me, Connor.
Yeah.
Be sure to tune in next week, and be sure to follow again at BGN Lab on Twitter and at ON Environment. In the coming weeks, we will be looking for playtesters, and we will be putting our games on the internet so that you can play at home and give us some invaluable feedback. I'm Steven. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.